So, what do spiritually abusive churches and abusive spiritual leaders do to the people in their churches? In the last video from this playlist on church hurt, we talked about the things they say, but I'd like to look more into the actions now. And look, had I seen this video years ago, or had you shared your story of church hurt with me, I probably would have been like, this is impossible. There's no way that can be happening in a church, right? Unfortunately, experience has shown us that these things do happen in churches. And although I'll be sharing 12 things that are done in spiritually abusive environments, I'm sure there's many more. And if you've walked through this, you're definitely going to identify with some of the things I share, but you may have even had experiences beyond the scope of what I discussed today. And if you feel like it would add value to someone else and would like to be vulnerable, I invite you to share the other things that are done in the comments. And if it's insightful, we may even pin it to the top for other people to learn from your experience as well. So let's get into the 12 things that spiritually abusive churches do, and know that I'm grateful to have you here with us on the video. I'm AaronJDaigle, an international speaker traveling to minister in churches and Christian events. I've also authored several books which are linked in the description below. You can check those out, and who knows, by the time you watch this video, there may even be a book down there on church hurt going deeper into these concepts than what I'm even able to do here on the videos. So what are the 12 things that spiritually abusive churches do? The first is they'll resist your desire to leave and will even refuse to bless it. In other words, if you feel like it's time to go to another church and express that to the spiritual leader, to your pastor, you may get a lot of kickback and be told that you're stepping out of the will of God, that you're making a mistake. While in extreme cases, a pastor who believes he is your covering and is your blessing, that by leaving from under his leadership, you are going to step out into the unknown and be attacked, perhaps even cursed by God, and that bad things are going to happen to you and your family for leaving. Another caveat about this is to simply spread around the church these rumors that the people who left did so on bad terms, whether or not that was the case. I do recall one incident where a particular family tried to meet with our former pastor over and over again to go and discuss their desire to leave, and he shucked them around and just refused to meet with them. And then after several tries, they no longer attended the church, and then the pastor went around telling everybody they just up and left without ever talking to him. In a healthy environment, a pastor will either fully release you, or if he is concerned, will express those concerns, but telling you that, in my opinion, this is a bad idea. However, I support you and I love you and we're always here for you if you ever want to come back. That's a very godly way of handling the situation when, as a minister, you feel like the people under your care are making a bad decision. But threatening and spreading rumors and insinuating that God is going to release his wrath on you for leaving, that is simply abusive and unhealthy. Now, the second thing spiritually abusive leaders do is dangle a carrot in front of you. If you are involved in ministry, chances are you want to continue growing and expanding. You want to stretch your faith and do even more things for the kingdom. And a spiritually abusive leader will perceive that, or even know that because you've expressed it, and will use that in front of you to get you to do what they need you to do now. So if you know from the testimony I shared on one of the previous videos in this playlist, we were pastoring the Spanish congregation, but I communicated to our lead pastor that I always felt like God called us to travel. And the story was, well, if you do this in our church, then one day God is going to release you. And that one day coming when God would release us went on for about a decade without God ever releasing us. And by God, in that last sentence, I mean our former pastor, because he was the one who was holding us there and telling us that God would not bless us if we left and went out and traveled, but that if we committed a little more and served a little more there in his church, that one day God would just show up and he would open up the door for us. Now, traveling as a minister was the carrot that was used for us because that was the carrot that appealed to me. But the carrot can be anything. A leader can tell you, well, if you do this or that in my church, then God is going to bless you with a spouse. Or the reason you're sick or not able to have children is because you haven't given X amount of donations to this ministry. The examples are endless, but the point is that spiritually abusive leaders will usually dangle some kind of carrot in front of you to continue moving you along the journey of getting you to do what it is they want you to do. Number 3, they will elevate people who support the vision and shun people who they claim no longer support it. In other words, they build a leadership team of yes men who are obedient to what it is the leader is telling them to do. As long as you comply and go along with whatever that pastor is wanting, then you're lifted, you're put on a platform, you're spoken well of, you're set up as an example, you're acknowledged, you get the accolades. On the flip side, you can be best friends with those pastors for many years and be receiving all those accolades, but when something happens that they now perceive that you no longer are following their vision, or you're not willing to take the next step that they're wanting you to go in, you will experience a breach in the relationship and you will be shunned shunned and talked down about, and you'll lose that leadership position in the church, and titles will be removed from you. In other words, people are not put over ministries in the church based on burden or calling or gifting. Instead, leadership titles and positions are used as a rewards and punishment system to get people to comply and to remove those who don't. Number 4, they will jab at you from the pulpit without other people knowing necessarily, but with you knowing what it is they're doing. Here's a minor example of what I mean. I had told my former pastor that my wife and I would not be able to go to prayer on Saturday morning. He was very angry that we would not be attending, gave us kickback, but I simply refused to go. I said, "Look, Pastor, I can't make it. I'm sorry, I will not be there." Well, the next day, Sunday morning, main service, he's preaching about how people are committed no matter what, that they prioritize the things of God, the house of God. And he has the pastor who was standing next to us stand up in front of the church, and he says, "I want y'all to know that Pastor so-and-so has never missed prayer. He's been faithful. He's been committed. He's never told me he wasn't going to be able to make it. He prioritizes prayer because he is a man of God." So the church claps for him, and the pastor standing next to us was smiling and very happy to receive the acknowledgement. What he didn't know and what the church didn't know was that had nothing to do with him, nor the desire from the lead pastor to preach about people being faithful. It was a jab at us to stick it to us from the pulpit. Now, that particular example is rather childish, but it illustrates how this is done in churches. And if you're under a spiritually abusive leader operating with this particular tactic, then you may be getting hit with things from the pulpit that aren't just immature jabs like I just explained, but are rather hurtful and are deep-seated pains that you are being attacked on. If a preacher is using the pulpit to take jabs at people in the audience, that is definitely an abuse of spiritual authority. Now, the 5th thing spiritually abusive leaders do is put you on a guilt trip. Any tactic used to manipulate you into doing something you don't really want to do by making you feel like you should do it even though you don't want to is a guilt trip. It can be giving more of your money than what God has told you to give, or giving more of your time than what God has told you to give, or prioritizing the church over your family, or any other thing. And another side to this is using guilt to garner the attention and the sympathy of the other team members in the leader's favor against the person the leader is upset with. In other words, the story was, "Look at what I've done for this person," saying that to the other team members, and then look at how bad this person is now treating me. So the other team members would sympathize with the hurt of the pastor, and then the pastor could then use that to generate an anger from the team towards that particular person. The 6th thing spiritually abusive leaders will do is attack you when it serves their interest. Now, I told you the story on one of the other videos on this playlist, how our former lead pastor told us that we were not allowed to preach out and travel and speak in any other church, that we had to stay where we were and only minister in our local church. We chose to submit to that and honored him by telling pastors we weren't available. Now, when I shared that story with you, I asked you to remember it because we would bring it up later on when we talked about some of the things spiritually abusive leaders do. So now let me give you the second half to that. I did that for 3 years, and during the time, anyone who asked me to go and speak in their church, I told them I wasn't available, but that once I became available, I would reach out and let them know. Anytime that happened, I wrote that pastor's name down on a list. And after 3 years, my former pastor met with me in a restaurant and told me, "Aaron, I feel like God spoke to me and told me to release you to go out and preach. You have my blessing. You can start preaching out again." So that evening, I went home and I called every pastor on that list and said, "Hey, just letting you know that my schedule's opened up. I'm available. If you want to make good on that preaching engagement, let me know." A few of them booked me right away. A few others called my former pastor just as a respect. Pastors do that if there's a preacher inside of a local church still who hasn't been traveling full time. Well, when they called my former pastor, he told them that he had told me not to go preach out, that he had not blessed it, and that I was calling them behind his back. So our first thoughts were hurt and confusion. Why is he doing this? We've honored him. Then we learned over time that he had been telling other people in the church that we were about to be leaving, and that since we had not honored him and had been disloyal, that God was going to curse our ministry and that we weren't going to go anywhere without him. That's when we realized that what he did had nothing to do with us. It was to protect what he had told those other people. He needed us to not succeed without him because he wanted the other people on his team to feel like they could not succeed without him. So that's what I mean by the leader attacking you with a particular interest behind it. It serves their purpose to go after you. If what you're experiencing is something to that extreme, that is definitely spiritual abuse. Now, I suspect in the majority of cases, it's usually some type of misunderstanding or a clash of personalities, or you've grown one way and the church and the pastor have grown another, and now it's creating some tension. But to say that's always the case and there's never malicious intent behind it, because there's no way a pastor would intentionally hurt somebody, is simply inaccurate. That type of stuff does happen, and if you've experienced that and you only remember one thing from this entire video, know this, that not all pastors are like that, and you are simply in an abusive situation. Now, the 7th thing abusive churches do is excommunicate people who leave. Now, there are several reasons for this. One is to stop all the other people in the church from hearing the person who left's side of the story. Another is to set an example of what will happen to you if you leave. But this idea of somebody who leaves our church is no longer a good person, and so we can't associate with them. And the spiritual leaders spread rumors about that person around the church and then tell that person that they can't contact anyone in their church. That is evil, it is ungodly, and it is overstepping spiritual authority. A pastor has no right to tell someone they cannot be friends with you because you attend their church. That is controlling your relationships with other people outside of the church that person pastors. God gets no gratification from severed relationships and broken friendships. He's always about unity, reconciliation, working through your differences, putting others above yourselves, moving forward as the body of Christ in one mind and one accord. The eighth thing spiritually abusive churches do is sweep stuff under the rug. Just 2 days ago, I ran into someone from the Spanish church I used to pastor who named the pastor before me, the pastor before him, and the pastor after me, so all four of us, and said, we lost him, you, and the last guy, and we knew nothing. We asked questions and we were told not to worry about it, that it's being taken care of. Things are done behind the scenes and then aren't brought forth to light. The idea is that the less the church people know, then the better off we are, and that is simply inaccurate. Church people are not stupid. They're just as intelligent as the ministers leading the churches. And when something isn't right, they feel it, and when that sensor is going off in their spirit, but then they're being told, oh, everything's okay, don't worry about it, something doesn't line up, and it creates confusion. Now, I'm not advocating we throw discretion to the wind and air everybody's dirty laundry out in front of the entire assembly, but letting people know what's going on instead of keeping everything in the dark is a really good practice because it builds trust and promotes accountability. Now, the ninth thing abusive spiritual leaders do is control your information input. In other words, you're only allowed to discuss your issues with people on the team, and of course, if you remember from point number 3, the only people on the team are all the yes men who do and say exactly what the pastor says and does. Now, the Bible says there is safety in a multitude of advisors, but if every one of your advisors is in the same exact little group, then you're getting the same advice. It's the same voice that is speaking to you, it's just coming from a few different mouths. The idea of having many advisors is having voices in your life who are outside of just one channel. So if it's just your church that speaks into your life, just your pastor and his team, then you're not getting any outside objective voice. Now, in our case, any outside voice that we sought after was condemned. Our former pastor tried to discredit those voices so that his voice would be the only one in our lives. For example, I started seeing a therapist to get help with what we were going through in our church. When I told our former pastor we were seeing the therapist, he asked about his religious beliefs, and I said, well, he's Christian, he's just of this denomination. And his remark was a very sarcastic, like, oh, that's who you're letting speak into your life. Another angle to this is when you spoke to anyone on the leadership team, they would then go back and report to the pastor. So he had a tight grip on what people were discussing, what they were being told, and then tried his best to limit how many outside voices were speaking into that web. Now, you can really get sucked into this where you start blowing off your parents and your friends and other people who are concerned and are seeing some red flags, and you can really lose your footing during this time, because if someone is controlling your information input, they're controlling how you think. The 10th thing spiritually abusive leaders will do is force you to serve. Now, I talked about this a little bit on the earlier video in this playlist on the 9 signs of spiritual abuse, but I'd like to go back into it, give you an example, and show you a point here, and that is that all of these things work together in unison. A lot of these things are tied together and blended. So to make that point, let me share a story of what happened here. And to make it interesting, I have to tell you one thing before I get started. I have never failed a class in school my entire life. I had 2 years of preschool, kindergarten, 12 years of school, and then went on to get 3 college degrees, one of them being a master's. So all those years in school, never failed. Okay, so there was a time our former church was doing fundraisers. We were selling concessions at the state university football games. So I'm working at the church throughout the week, and I'm working on my college degree. I was also teaching in the public school system, and I had a class that was just really beating me up, and I was working on the school project, working on the project. Then Friday evening came, and it was time to go to the stadium. I told the lead pastor that I could not go. I had to work on my schoolwork. He called me up very upset and said, I'm not going to have a student pastor who isn't showing up to the fundraiser. So either you come or we can find another student pastor. Well, God had called me to be the student pastor at that time, and I had a genuine burden for those young people. So what was I going to do, right? I went to the fundraiser, and yes, I failed the class. I tried with the professor, pleaded and begged, and she refused to accept it. So when I met with the lead pastor and explained what had happened, I said, man, I failed this class. He then put it back on me, well, you should have had better time management, etc. And to be fair to him, there was a bit of truth in that. But to tell a young student pastor who loves these teenagers that if you don't do this, I'm taking that from you, is what I mean by forcing forcing you to serve. No, he didn't literally make me do it, but he combined several tactics that we've been talking about in this video to get his will accomplished. So what do we have? Dangling the carrot. If you want to be the student pastor, you're going to have to do this. Elevating me into that position for submission, or threatening to remove the position for resistance. We have guilt tripping. Oh, if you love the students, then you're going to come to the fundraiser, because if you don't, then you're not going to be able to help the students. So in one conversation, we have 3 of the things that we've talked about just in this video alone, all in operation. So when I say abusive spiritual leaders will force you to serve, like I mentioned in that other video, what I'm saying is that they will use all these tactics that we're talking about in this video and in the other videos, all in combination to manipulate you into submission. The 11th thing abusive churches will do is condemn you for telling other people what's going on. It is taboo to talk about the things I'm discussing in this video. It's as if pointing out that a pastor is wrong is a clear indication that you are wrong. It is viewed as being disloyal, as touching the Lord's anointed, as being unsubmitted or rebellious. And since you don't want to be that type of person, you don't talk about it. And it's not like you can go to another pastor, because what Christian leader is going to hear you out when you're pointing out the issues with Christian leaders? Well, the issue here is that it makes healing very difficult. In our next video on this playlist, we're going to talk about how to heal from all this. I'm going to invite you into more of our story of not only what happened in the former church, but what happened after and how we got through this. But for us, what took so long to even take that step of starting the healing process was that we were afraid to talk about it. We couldn't tell anyone what was going on. And anytime I barely mentioned a little piece of it, I felt so guilty, like something was wrong with me and I had to go repent. And if you are being condemned and attacked for pointing out the issues and the concerns that you clearly see, then you might be sitting under an abusive spiritual leader. Now, the 12th thing spiritually abusive leaders do is they hurt you. This is real. Church hurt happens. And just like a child who is abused physically, someone who trusts in a spiritual authority but then experiences the types of things we've been talking about can be broken in this process. The whole concept is someone who is innocent, trusting in another person who is supposed to take care of and provide for and help, but then that trust being violated. Not only that, but sometimes even mocked. There are people who believe that you and I are rebels, that we're crazy for talking about this stuff, like this isn't even an issue, that we're the problem. Yet we walk through it and we know the pain and we face that question every single day after this stuff happens. What now? Where do I go from here? How do I get through this? How do I heal? How do I put myself back together and move forward in Christ? And that's what we're going to discuss together in our next 2 videos on this playlist: how to heal and how to re-engage in ministry. So be sure to continue that journey with me right here from this playlist. And remember to subscribe and notify the bell to stay updated with all the new uploads.